to you all. I'm Alex Jones. I'm the director of the Insurgent Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy. I think some folks will be drifting in during the presentation, but we don't want to waste the time that we have with our two distinguished and fascinating guests. When we were approached about what we, the Insurgent Center, wanted to do for IDEASpHERE for this lunch, we took no time at all to focus on Nicco Mele and Morra Aarons-Mele as a team making a presentation about the world that is evolving, meaning the digital world, the internet world, the world that they both have been pioneers in and are now some of the most sophisticated people who are out there consulting, being consulted, and really sort of engaging the technology in especially a political sense. Morra is Director of Internet Marketing, or she has her own agency, a marketing agency. She was, I was writing down some things I wanted to specifically say about Hillary. She helped Hillary Clinton log on to her first internet chat. She was the Director of Internet Marketing for the Democratic National Committee in 2004, and she's a Kennedy School graduate. Nicco was the webmaster for Howard Dean's 2004 presidential bid. His company, Echo Ditto, is a consulting company. Among his clients have been Obama's Senate campaign, the Clinton Global Initiative. The point is, they were both, Nicco and Morra, self-described nerds with a passion for politics. And that is the thing that sets them apart in particular, as far as I'm concerned. They are also, dare I say it, superb teachers. And both of them have been, I'm very glad to say, teaching for the Insurgent Center and Harvard students, and they do a great job. They really do, and that is why we wanted them to be with you today. I want to also mention that Nicco has a book, a wonderful book called The End of Big, How the Internet Makes David the New Goliath. They were our natural and first choice for today. And their topic is Internet, the Peril and Promise of. Excellent. Nicco, Morra. Thank you.
Hi, sweetie.
Hi.
It's a little weird. We've never done this. So we thought that looking back on 9 years of political crossfire.
Wedding anniversary was this past Monday, 8 years.
That we would talk about politics, media, work, everything through the framework of how the digital age has radically transformed it, and of course is still transforming things. So we're going to have a conversation, and I'm going to start, just ask Nicco a few questions of things that have come up for us in our career. We always seem to be on opposing sides of races or clients even. When we met, of course, I worked for John Kerry, I worked at the Democratic National Committee, I was like big institutional Democratic politics. And he was Howard Dean, you know, he was the cool kid blogging and making it all up. But it's interesting to think about, you know, that was 10 years ago, how much has changed and how little has changed. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk about media, we're going to talk about blogging, all that good stuff. Anything you want to say, Nicco?
That was great.
And then another funny story about opposition is, so I worked for Kerry, he worked for Dean, and then after that we both, you know, he started his firm, Echo Ditto, and I went to work at Edelman, the large communications firm, the world's largest communications firm, actually, and started a department for them in digital public affairs, and I had clients that were big, like pharma, you know, Vioxx, remember the big Vioxx lawsuit? So I would be in charge of taking out online ads, telling people that Vioxx was safe. He had all these clients who were unions, and he would
consumer advocacy groups.
And consumer advocacy groups, and he'd be in charge of alternately trying to outbid me for Google Ads, saying to sue the pants off Vioxx. And then I worked for Walmart, and he worked for the union that was trying to get Walmart to unionize. And so we always seem to be kind of having this tension. So we first met back in early 2005, and you worked for Howard Dean, I worked for Carrie, we talked about that. And, you know, it's funny because Carrie won the primary, right? Dean lost the famous scream. And, you know, I do think, though, that you kind of lost the battle but won the war in terms of really transforming politics. And of course, at the Democratic National Committee and in institutional Big D Democratic politics, we kind of stole everything that Dean pioneered and brought it in-house, and that's still the gold standard today. And we always joke, the plus ça change la même. You know, the more things have changed in politics, the more they stay the same. Today, most online political campaigns still use email marketing as a cash cow, and then they go spend that money on television, right? So I guess my first question for you is, did Dean succeed at changing politics for the better, or did institutions just copy your innovations? And how much of an influence has the internet really had on politics in the past 10 years?
I think from where you and I sit, it feels like not much has happened, because in our professional practice of digital campaigning, the tools and techniques used today are remarkably similar to the tools and techniques from 18, 15, 10 years ago. Successful online campaigns still revolve substantially around email and the inbox. Innovations like YouTube, Twitter, even now maybe you could say Pinterest, and maybe we'll put Bitcoin in that category. They seem very exciting and new, but at the heart of successful online campaigns, tried and true tactics are still don't feel like they're the same as they ever were. I sometimes get very frustrated in my consulting practice because it's boring, because I feel like I'm doing exactly what I've been doing for a long time. I think what, from our perspective, we miss is the way that these tools and tactics have really fundamentally changed the landscape of what's possible. It seems so natural today that Barack Obama is president. We forget that in 2007, that was anything but a foregone conclusion. In fact, I went and pulled up a whole bunch of the news headlines 90 days prior to the Iowa caucus in 2007, and Obama does not figure at all in the media narrative. This is about Hillary and maybe John Edwards, right? He's like a compelling candidate, but it's not his turn. And so, you know, the question is, here's Hillary Clinton. She's worked in 2007, she's worked on every presidential campaign since she was 18. She knows every major player in the Democratic Party down to the municipal level. She knows every major donor. Her husband, arguably one of the most popular presidents in American history. She's a U.S. Senator. The Democratic Party headquarters in Washington, D.C. quite literally has her name on it. It is the party that Bill and Hillary built, and she loses the primary to a man who's been in public life less than a decade. That is an impossible, that at the time felt impossible, and yet it happened.
And did it happen because of the internet? I mean, that's kind of easy fallback narrative, right? It happened because of the internet.
Absolutely it happened. Well, it happened in part because Obama was a compelling candidate. That, I think, is one. It happened, too, because of the deep dissatisfaction in the base, in the grassroots, with the direction the elites were taking the party. That was a big part of what fueled Dean's candidacy. Was of all 8 Democratic presidential candidates in 2003, Howard Dean was the only one who opposed the Iraq War. And even people who maybe supported the war in Iraq felt like Howard Dean was listening to the base of the party in the way that the elites like John Kerry were not. And so there was a deep undercurrent of dissatisfaction with the status quo and with the elites of the party. Frankly, over the last 30 years, the Democratic and Republican parties have both become primarily networks of major donors, not grassroots political parties. And so it was a combination of, one, a very compelling candidate in Obama who embodied change, in part by the color of his skin, and a weakened establishment that had become mostly a fundraising network, not a real political party. A deep dissatisfaction on the part of the base with the party elites. And then the internet comes along and levels the playing field in terms of financial competitiveness. And unless you think this is a story just of the Democratic Party, this is exactly what's playing out with the Tea Party in the Republican Party. You have an establishment that has lost touch with the establishment elites who've lost touch with the base of the party, who are primarily a checkbook, a major donor network, not a grassroots party, who have ignored a variety of important trends in their own base. And you add smaller dollar fundraising to make insurgent candidates competitive, and suddenly the establishment is taken by surprise. In 2010 and 2012, we have more than a dozen U.S. Senate races where the establishment Republican candidate loses in the primary to the Tea Party insurgent, including 3 sitting U.S. senators losing in their own primary, which is almost unprecedented in American politics. We have a kind of an interesting dynamic. We're still in the middle of the primary season this year. We've had some establishment wins, also had some Tea Party wins as recently as this past Tuesday. But I think very much there's this, well, from where we sit, the tactics we've employed for over a decade feel very tired and institutionalized. The reality is, in the broader landscape, those tactics have really upended a bunch of assumptions about power in the establishment.
But what I'm hearing the thread throughout is that the real gift of the internet to politics is more money. I mean, that's the one thing that has not changed. And frankly, when you're listening and you're talking about elites tired of the way things are, you're talking to me about Obama right now and the Democratic Party and what's happening in 2016.
Well, I think that the role of the technology has been clearest in the fundraising.
Yeah.
I think it's been, and the second thing that's been very clear is the way it's changed the ground game. Obama in 2008 and 2012 used the internet to really organize a field campaign, get out the vote campaign in a very compelling way. Big part of the Tea Party movement. You know, there's this narrative, which is at least partially true, of a couple of billionaires funding the Tea Party, but it's also, I think, a genuinely grassroots movement on the ground. You can see that in the meetups, in the face-to-face meetings. I went to a Tea Party meetup here in Cambridge, Massachusetts once to see if it was real, and it indeed was. I think there's a real, the field piece of this, the on-the-ground piece of this, replacing what used to be local party meetings, is also a real hallmark of the internet. As I'm fond of saying that the #1 thing people do on Facebook is they organize face-to-face offline meetings. That's the primary use of Facebook, right, is to organize events.
And what I find shocking is I'm working with a client right now on organizing an event via Facebook, and for $20, we can promote that post just with a credit card and reach hundreds of new people. I mean, that to me,
targeted new people,
absolutely targeted. You know, I want to reach people in Europe. I want to reach women. I can absolutely target that. And you think about, I mean, that to me is power, and that's important. I mean, we often joke that the true radical change of the internet, especially in politics, is the stuff that you can't see. Twitter is exciting and YouTube is exciting, but the real power is what's happened behind in terms of using technology to organize and get out that ground game.
I do think there have been 3 shifts in politics over the last 10 years. They're very clear in American politics, and they're increasingly clear in international situations. And all of them are digitally driven. The first is the shift from intuitive to empirical. What could not be measured before, what you had to do on your gut, can now be measured. You can assess it. You can give it much greater accuracy. You can build predictive models. The data that's available to collect, the data modeling, has really changed how political campaigns are run in the United States, at least. The second shift is from mass media, buying a bunch of TV ads, to targeted voter contact, to almost on an individual basis outreach. You know, DirecTV has now, you can buy ads on a per house basis. Television ads. It's really a mind-boggling change that was impossible a decade ago.
Absolutely.
So if one shift is from intuitive to empirical, and the second shift is from mass media to individual voter contact, then the third shift is from persuasion, persuading the middle, to mobilizing the base. that it used to be, it was very hard to measure how you would mobilize the base and how you would get the base out to vote. But thanks to digital technology, it's actually very easy now, or I shouldn't say easy. Well, it's complicated, but it's not hard, right? To measure the base and to figure out the turnout.
Well, and that's where, of course, internet communities really aid your case, because what the internet is really, really good at is giving huge voice to small amount of people who really care, right? And we see this in everything from mothering communities online, right? Don't ever come across an angry lactivist, right? A breastfeeding activist online, because she will take you down. And of course you see it in politics, right? And so with the internet, when you have that knowledge as a political organizer, you can go to that meetup group, you can go to that blogger, you can go to that small mobilized minority and say, take this and run with it. And of course it has a huge impact. And that's a profound shift as well.
And I think that has real ramifications, not just in politics, but in corporations, in nonprofits, in pop culture. And its big shift, I think, is around the staffing, is around how you organize, manage, and staff your communications teams, your marketing teams, your fundraising teams. Because to be nimble and to manage this data, the data management, you just need a different skill set and a different kind of org chart to be successful in that kind of environment. And you know, government is, you know, I think we've seen with the kind of botched healthcare.gov rollout, we have a dozen U.S. states with major IT projects that are at least $50 million over budget. You know, there's a whole host of challenges in terms of what this means for institutions.
And I remember actually, just bringing it full circle back to Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, is that you said to me, one of the biggest fights of our marriage was I was a staunch Hillary fan, but at the same time, off the record, I was really trying to get the campaign to embrace working with women online, with vast communities of moms online who really would mobilize for Hillary, and they kind of didn't listen, right? They didn't care. And Nicco kept saying, it's okay, Hillary's not going to win. There's this guy, Barack Obama, he's going to win. He's an insurgent. Which during the time of the Iraq War, it was not popular. You were banished. But you know, but he was right. You were right. And ultimately, though, I want to hear. It's true. But honestly, what I think also that pointed to was a failure in a certain kind of leadership. That the Clinton campaign was still in leadership 1.0, and the Obama team, as you just alluded to, understood leadership in the digital age. I mean, would you say that that's a fair point?
Yeah, I mean, I think I always say that, you know, like Hillary just recently, about 6 weeks ago, said the last time she drove a car was 1996, I thought. And I was like, what? You know, Obama, because he was not in public life, I don't know this, but in all likelihood, he paid his cable bill online. He did online banking.
I think Michelle did, actually.
He ordered books on Amazon. And, you know, I don't know Hillary's life, but not driving, you end up living in this elite bubble. And I think you can miss profound changes in the day-to-day experience people have with the internet. And I think that filters down into your leadership and your experience in the world. I mean, I do think you and your firm worked with the Obama campaign in 2012 to reach women online, and you had a real direct experience of the campaign. And I'm kind of curious to hear a little more about that, because it always seemed like the Obama campaign was one of the most disciplined, most empirically driven campaigns I had ever experienced.
Absolutely, and I mean, I think that I credit the Obama campaign with understanding how nodes in an online network can really mobilize offline. I mean, that's the key. If you can understand that, you can get anything done. And of course, you know, when I was here, I studied with Robert Putnam, and it was a profoundly life-changing experience because I learned how powerful nodes in a network of bridging social ties, so not me and my best friends, but me and people that I might know professionally, that I might know from my community. If I can connect with them, I can have power, right? And that's what the Obama campaign understood. So when they hired us to go organize mom bloggers in targeted states, it was all part of that strategy, which is, I know this mom blogger has, you know, 100,000 readers a month, but she's also influential offline, she's on Twitter, she's on Facebook, she's got power, and so I need to go to her directly, and then she will mobilize her troops. I mean, it's the same thing as precinct walking in traditional politics. but it's a purely online model, and I think that's the key.
I do think there is a difference, though, in that we title this the promise and peril of the internet, because the digital world opens up all this opportunity, but it opens it up frequently outside of established institutions, established ways of doing things, and that sometimes means there's not integrity there, right? That there aren't ways of ensuring that accuracy, authority, you know, the precinct blocking, part of the traditional structure of the political party really did bring some integrity to leadership. Really did try, and I mean, there's plenty of, you know, Tammany Hall and back scratching, but there was also some checks and balances to ensure some quality outcomes on a leadership front, on a policy front.
I have to absolutely call foul on that, and I think this is a profound sentiment. I still think Professor Putnam would say that online social networks do not have traditional social capital. I firmly disagree, and I disagree with you there. Online communities have to keep each other accountable. From Wikipedia to online coding communities, places like GitHub where you put up code and people perfect it, to my particular community of Moms Online. We are accountable because we use our real names and we know each other. And this is actually a really interesting point, which I didn't put in my notes, but I'd love to hear about. You know, Sherry Turkle down at MIT was an early internet theorist, and she thought back in the day, and I remember when I met you, you had an avatar online that was like an ogre. Do you remember that? And you played World of Warcraft. So early internet folks thought that when we went online in a communitarian way, we'd adopt avatars. We'd be ogres, or we'd be, if I was a woman, I'd be a big strong man, or if I was a man, I'd be a little girl. That we would adopt these kind of fantasy creative selves. And if you look at Sherry Turkle and early internet theorists writing, that's what they wrote about. What's happened is the opposite. You're actually your most real self online, right? If I'm on Facebook as Morra, I'm like not only me, I'm hyper me. My house is clean, my marriage is perfect, my kids are great, my career is fabulous. And I have to have integrity because people, all I have is my reputation online. And so I would argue actually that if you understand that and if you understand how online social capital works, you can actually get a lot of organizing done the same way that you could before in a precinct blocking situation.
I think it's a little bit
that might
of
be Pollyanna-ish.
I think it's a little bit of a paradox because I think there's in some senses two internets. There's one that is all about being who you are, right? About the accountability. Facebook's terms of service say you cannot use a pseudonym. You must use your real name. You must be your real person.
Not only that, your clients are on it, your friends are on it, your family.
And so the social network creates a kind of, oh boy, I do not like the word integrity in that context. The Facebook, the nature of the social network creates a kind of accountability, maybe.
And transparency.
And transparency, asterisk. Because it's a mediated transparency. You're deciding what part of, I remember you said to me once, boy, to follow you on Facebook, you'd think you're an ideal father, when in fact you've been away the last 200 days. And so, I never forgot it because it's true.
Well, that's your curated self.
That's my curated self.
He wants to be a good dad in his online brand.
I want to be the period. But I do think that's part of the point, right? That when you're online, you inhabit this persona, this personality, and that creates actually all kinds of challenges, I think, for example, in journalism, in politics, in marketing, branding, communication, and also in, there is a different internet, actually, one that's totally anonymous. The internet of 4chan, the internet of Tor, right? A completely anonymous situation. And in some ways, these two worldviews, one where anonymity is actually an important part of integrity, it's an important part of holding power accountable. The hacker collective is called anonymous on purpose, right? That's a central component of their ability to hold power accountable and to make a case for free speech. The other view of the internet is almost this totalitarian, propaganda-driven slave to presenting a certain kind of self. And I think that they create real challenges in terms of communication.
That's a very dark view, because from my, I mean, right? I mean, I won't argue with you with the dark internet. I don't even want to go there, frankly. But from my perspective, also, I find the internet very liberating because, you know, and I write a lot about this from the women's perspective. You know, traditionally coming back to social networks, women didn't have access to them. We didn't have access to power. And there's a famous quote, which I always use, which is after work, men head to the bar or the golf course, and women head to the dry cleaners and the grocery store and to pick up the kids. And so, you know, it was a very gendered world of power. And from my perspective, the internet has changed all that. I can have access through LinkedIn, through listservs, through Twitter, to all layers of power in society that I never could, and I can be in my home office in Lexington. And so that is the promise of the internet. You know, the promise of the internet is totally blowing up traditional barriers and letting, you know, true access shine. Now, of course, that's only probably 1/4 of the story.
Well, I mean, I think that was on purpose, actually, right? That most of the great digital pioneers grew up on college campuses in the 60s, in the middle of the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. And computers were institutional things in the late 60s and early 70s.
Who's watching Mad Men with the computer?
No,
Very scary.
I'm not. But the, you know, so computers are these institutional things, and there was a real movement among the young pioneers of the digital age, people, familiar household names, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, to take computers away from institutions and make them devices of individual empowerment. The idea of the personal computer was this crazy notion that grew quite explicitly in part out of the countercultural anti-war movement of the 60s. And so that is both fantastic in the flexibility and the power it gives in working from home and co-working and distributed workplaces, but it also creates other challenges of accountability, integrity, and institutional process.
Right. Let's shift gears. Let's talk a little bit about, I do want to come back to the what can we expect in 2012 is we're going to have status quo. 2016, and we're going to have status quo, we're going to have insurgency, but we'll hold on that. Let's talk about social media, let's talk about journalism. After all, we are here on behalf of the Shorenstein Center, you know, the radical shift in journalism that's happened. When I was here, I took a course with Howard Gardner over at the Ed School, and I did a research paper on bloggers, and I wanted to know, are bloggers, do they think of themselves as citizen journalists, which again is the kind of easy box, right? They're taking over the press. No more press. It's all going to be a bunch of bloggers digging up the story on their own. Or are they entrepreneurs? It's my belief, and I found this through my research, that most people who want to build a presence online, a big blog, a big Twitter following, and they're doing it outside of their professional work. I mean, that's been a really interesting shift that's happened, is that, you know, whereas kind of blogging and tweeting and being an individual lone ranger online used to be about being not part of an institution, you've actually seen the great institutions of journalism just subsume that culture, and now, you know, a journalist is responsible for blogging, a journalist is responsible for being on Twitter. That's just part of their job. I mean, that's been a big shift we don't even think about. Anyway, so I did all this research, and I really found that bloggers were not really citizen journalists, they were entrepreneurs. They were people who wanted to build a brand. They were people who wanted to almost, they thought of their blogs as a storefront. If I was an entrepreneur and I had a small business, this is my storefront, this is my home on the web. And I think that that's really profound, because I think that leaves a question of, well, so what is the room for the press? If we're not going to have a lot of citizens taking over, which is what people thought, we actually have a lot of citizens wanting to be rich and famous, which is the American way. And where does the press find themselves? Is the press part of that? You know, we have these kind of celebrity journalists now who have huge online followings and don't need to be part of an institution. You know, everything has gone kind of anti-institutional, and people are out there on their own sort of making news, we think.
I mean, I think that there is, journalism is facing in some ways its greatest challenges, you know, maybe in the last 100 years, but also the greatest opportunity. We see it in the production of news, in the distribution of news, in the business models for news. In all three kind of buckets, there are fascinating and profound changes happening. And like I just did this experiment. I took the New York Times, I took the Washington Post, I took 5 or 6 big national news organizations. I looked at their following on Twitter and their following on Facebook. And then I went and took the top 20 individual journalists at the New York Times, right? You know, like David Folkenflik.
He's at NPR.
He's at NPR. No.
Nate Silver.
Well, that's not a good
He's
example.
gone too. This is interesting. Jill Abramson, no, sorry.
But I made a list of the top journalists at the New York Times and their Twitter followings. You could take any in the top 20, you could add together any 3 to 5 of them and have a larger audience than the New York Times itself on Twitter. And so that is like a profound shift from the audience following the institution to the audience following the individual. Now, it is complicated. Part of the way they've been able to build those followings is because of their association with the New York Times.
Absolutely.
Like it's this complicated interplay, and I think that part of the challenge is that most of the major news organizations we have are built around newsroom models that don't recognize the profound power of the individual in the digital age.
Yeah. But I would argue that someone like Ezra Klein, Nate Silver, would consider themselves entrepreneurs as much as they would consider themselves journalists.
I mean, they're interesting because they started as the amateur bloggers, and they built large online readerships, and then they moved inside of traditional institutions. So the New York Times, Ezra Klein, the Washington Post. They presumably learned a lot about reporting and writing and the process of producing journalism. And then they've left, right, to kind of question mark why they left. They found in part, I suspect, from what I've read and heard, that the institutional model of the newsroom didn't feel like it supported the kind of journalism they were trying to produce. You know, I do think we're in kind of an early. This is all very young. I mean, Twitter is. When was Twitter invented? 4 years ago? 5 years ago? We're not 07. Yeah. Well, it went into beta. It went into beta at South by Southwest in 07, right? So. So that's actually pretty new in the scheme of things. And what it means for the production, the distribution, the business models of journalism aren't entirely clear. One thing I'm sure of is that it's much more about individual activity, individual brand, individual power, and less of institutional power. And the challenge that creates is around investigative reporting and holding power accountable.
Well, and I think what's really interesting is you just look at the case study that's unfolded in the past 24 hours in the Abramson case, is that, you know, you kind of see the press eating its own and eating its own institution. You've got David Folkenflik on NPR reporting real time on Twitter. You've got Ken Auletta reporting in real time on the NewYorker.com. You absolutely have this story that is unfolding via social media in real time, taking on the largest and most august institution in journalism. I mean, it's kind of extraordinary. I want to make sure.
It may be not a good way to do reporting.
I don't know. I'm just a blogger. That's above my pay grade. So I want to leave lots of time for questions. Does anybody have a burning question right now they want to ask?
Go to 2016. That's good.
Do you want to go to 2016? All right, let's talk about 2016. So personally, I think, and I've always thought that Barack Obama was a fake insurgent. I can see that very little has changed. He hired a lot of the same people. He used the internet, and then once he got into office, it was like business as usual. So I'm curious, given that, what's going to happen in 2016? Are we going to have a real insurgent? Is Rand Paul a real insurgent?
Rand Paul is absolutely a real insurgent.
Or is Jeb Bush just going to come and go squash?
No, I mean, there's two, well, when I look at the Republican Party, I see a fascinating dynamic developing of definitely a group of what we might think of as establishment Republican candidates. You know, you could put Jeb Bush in that category, you could put Chris Christie in that category, you could put, John Kasich, Mitch Daniels in that category. And then you have the kind of insurgents who appear to be preparing for a presidential run, people like Ted Cruz, like Rand Paul. And there's no doubt that the insurgent candidates are building fairly substantial email lists. I mean, I think of it a little bit like this, right? In the Democratic Party in 2003, the base was really unhappy with the elite leadership. There were the grassroots base consolidated around Howard Dean as the insurgent candidate, but the insurgent candidate ultimately lost to the establishment candidate. The establishment candidate, before Kerry, your friend, goes on to lose the presidency. In 2012, the insurgent candidate wins. Obama defeats Hillary Clinton. Right? It was like this kind of growing up, you might say, of the insurgent base in the Democratic Party. And I think that same story is happening right now on the Republican side, that in 2012, you had we didn't really have an insurgent Republican primary candidate in 08, but in 2012, we
had Sarah Palin.
But she wasn't a candidate, she was selected by,
Fair enough.
right? So in 2012 in the Republican Party, we had like 8 insurgent Republican candidates and only really 1 establishment candidate. And that diffusion of the insurgent energy really helped Romney clinch the nomination. But I think in 2016, in the Republican primary, we're going to see an insurgent candidate defeat a establishment candidate. And my money, for the most part, is on Rand Paul. He's the right mix of disciplined, not as off the reservation as Ted Cruz, not pissing off all the other Republican senators, but also, definitely an outsider to the Republican establishment. Not only is his father a real thorn in the side of the Republican establishment, but he has not been in public life very long at all, right? And so I think he is a very compelling insurgent candidate. And if he runs, he's going to represent real change. He's a young guy. He's not a baby boomer. He's a different generation running for president here, and has some very compelling things to say on everything from civil liberties to Social Security.
But I see Rand Paul and his father, I mean, in terms of talking about being born digital, I see them as emblematic of the peril of the internet age. They are completely untethered to any sense of institution, and also I think of any sense of real social fabric and kind of responsibility to your fellow person. I mean, that's what worries me is about growing up digital, is a sense that I am on my own here, and I'm going to go online and do what I want and say what I want and choose which institutions I'm affiliated with.
I think that libertarian ethos is actually very deeply embedded in digital culture.
Absolutely.
Right? And so I think it actually is, despite the fact that, beautiful individuals like you may not want to believe it, it actually is pretty close to something that's deeply embedded in the American soul, right? That the internet magnifies and intensifies. And I'll point out that Rand Paul, on issues like gay marriage and legalization of marijuana, is really appealing to a younger generation, right?
And immigration.
And immigration too. So I think Rand is a really interesting, really compelling. He can really take the war between the establishment business side of the party and the Tea Party insurgent side and craft a completely new Republican Party that's not going to look like either one.
What about Hillary? I saw Hillary on The View this morning.
And what did she say?
Well, she was fabulous. She and Barbara Walters were chatting it up, and it was kind of the softer side of Hillary.
Did it seem like she was running for president?
I was in the nail salon, so I couldn't hear. but
it's emblematic of the View's problem right there.
Right. Well, it doesn't matter what she says. What about Hillary?
Well, there's this question of is she running? I was really struck by I can't remember now who wrote it. Maybe it was this piece this last few days that said that all of the Ready for Hillary stuff is trying to convince her to run. It's not a shadow campaign being orchestrated by her. It's actually trying to persuade her to run,
by gathering a lot of email addresses, basically.
Well, but also by showing her kind of a readiness and a desire. I mean, if I'm in the shoes of Hillary and Bill Clinton, if Hillary doesn't run for office again, they will have an impressive and compelling legacy that history will smile upon. And if she runs for office, that is going to be high risk, especially if she loses or somehow the campaign is botched, or she wins and then botches governing, right? So I do think there is, there's much at stake for them as a couple and for their place in history. I also think that in the primary, boy, I could run a really compelling Democratic insurgent to beat her, right? I could, the two things Americans are most frustrated about, hate most, is Wall Street and the feeling that there's been real impropriety on the part of our CEOs and financial leaders in terms of how they have managed to run the economy for their own enrichment. And they're really deeply unsatisfied with what's happening in Washington, D.C. And I'm hard-pressed to name a single American politician more closely associated with Washington, D.C. and Wall Street than Bill and Hillary Clinton. And I think you could mount a very compelling campaign against her as a deeply establishment candidate who is responsible for all of she and her husband and their worldview and their advisors and the organizations they have built, including the Obama White House run by Rahm Emanuel, are responsible for a lot of the malfeasance we have from everything from the growing insane disparity between the rich and the poor in America and the college debt system we built, all of this. So I could mount a very compelling insurgent campaign against her.
I think Elizabeth Warren is just down the street.
Yeah. And also I will point out that all of those talking points are easily adopted by Rand Paul, and he is in many ways the perfect deliverer of them.
Right, and I would argue on the other side that I could mobilize a heck of a lot of women who would support her.
I can see where this one's going.
So I'm going to ask one more question, and then I want to open it up to the audience. But this is a fun one, and since we're sitting here in one of the world's most august institutions, famous institutions in the world, so you and I like to talk about what I call entrepreneurship porn. And this is the idea that young, bright, smart people, I would argue fueled by the media, who loves to cover entrepreneurs, especially young male ones, they want to start their own entities. And of course, internet culture powers this. Easy access to technology, easy access to IP, collaboration, being able to hire cheap tech in India, all the things that we think about really empowers this kind of race to entrepreneurship. And this is not just about being at the business school. I know we have it at the Kennedy School too, and we've actually looked at the data of graduates leaving the Kennedy School, the business school, Stanford Business School, Columbia Business School, and the absolute ginormous jump in people who leave these professional schools and start their own thing, whether it's a nonprofit, a social enterprise, or business, versus going into an institution, which is of course what we used to do. And this quote is something that we talk about at dinner, actually, and it's an incredible quote, which is from a brilliant young Harvard undergraduate and early Facebook employee, Mark Hammerbacher, and he said, "The best minds of my generation are thinking about how to make people click ads." And then there was another great article recently in the New York Times, and he said basically the same thing, that they're thinking about how to make sexting apps. And so I find this troubling. I think it's wonderful that young people have an entrepreneurial spirit. I think there are values in our institutions, especially in the nonprofit space. I think that we do not need a lot of new small nonprofits. We have a lot of great ones out there that really can use talent. I think it's a real problem in the digital age. And you teach here, you have some responsibility to these young minds. What are you telling them when they come to ask you for advice? And how do we help? How do we make sure it's not entrepreneurship porn, but it's that a real seeking to change?
I'm going to turn around on you. You graduated from the Kennedy School, and what did you do? You started your own business. You did not enter an established institution or organization. So why did you do that?
Because I had a kid. Honestly, I didn't want to be a working mother and be beholden to someone else's schedule.
So
I'm not the best example.
Entrepreneurs know. I think
but actually, that's
true.
That's why most people do start businesses.
Entrepreneurship provided flexibility and control over your schedule and your income in a way that was compelling to your lifestyle. I think that one of the challenges of a lot of existing institutions, government, the private sector, the nonprofit sector, is in fact that these institutions in various ways are inflexible to the needs, demands, desires, and ambitions of smart, young, motivated people. And I think that 30 years ago, if you were a smart, young, motivated person and you wanted some flexibility in your work, you wanted to be your own boss in some way, actually there weren't a lot of options. It was much harder to figure out. You had to find an office and get a telephone. Building an agency, building a company, building it was hard. Now you have a Gmail account. You spend $15 to get a domain name, and on the internet nobody knows your dog. On the internet nobody knows.
You're an entrepreneur. Boom.
Right? And in fact, there's some good academic research to show that the cost of starting an organization, whether it's a nonprofit or a private company, has dropped dramatically by 2 orders of magnitude in the last 10 years. In large part thanks to technology, but also some changes in regulation. And so it's easier to start your own thing. And the choice between like joining a giant organization and working your way up the ladder and having to do a whole bunch of grunt work and having to like wear a tie and come in 9 to 5 is frequently not nearly as compelling as starting your own thing. The challenge is I think that's leading to a real talent drain, a real brain drain out of our big institutions that need them the most now. Right? And so that's the tension. I kind of am very sympathetic to people who don't want to work in these big places, because frankly, I don't want to. That's part of why I started my company 10 years ago. But I also think that that's in tension with the reality that these institutions need talented leadership.
And I think we're in a real flux position now where companies understand that, and at least in the white-collar sector, there is workplace flexibility. You can be out of the office, but now we're all of course tethered to our devices. So we're in this horrible tension point where we, quote, have freedom, but no one has freedom, and it's a kind of a mess. So I think we have to work through that.
The norms for the digital age and working are not well established.
No, absolutely not. Questions?
So you had talked a little bit about the kind of all these forces that are happening where people are leaving the big institutions and how that's affecting the New York Times, for example, and we've got bloggers taking over. We see the beginnings of that happening in the higher ed sector as well. And now you've got like the Ivy institutions joining through the kind of Harvard X Coursera space. So I'd like to hear you reflect a little bit on kind of what's the end game here for organizations like the New York Times with the new paywalls, and how do you see that flowing through the higher ed space, and on what time frame, through what mechanism?
Well, I think that, in higher ed, the elite institutions operate in a different category. Broadly speaking, the cost of a 4-year college education in the United States has skyrocketed, its economic value has plummeted, and it's profoundly broken. I think for obvious reasons Harvard is somewhat exempt from that trend, but the way we've built our system of higher education, the way student loans work, it's just not going to persist in its current form. And the technology offers some pretty compelling ways. Has anybody taken an online course? Yeah, I recently finished a Coursera course on Beethoven's concertos. I knew nothing about classical music before I took it. I loved it. It was fantastic. It was like an exceptional quality of instruction. It was like way more awesome than anything I was expecting. That said, I have taught online, and I can't stand it as a teacher. Like for me, teaching is very much about the classroom dynamic. As a couple of my former students in the room will attest. I love the relationship of teaching and how much I learn in that process. And when I taught online, it was like all of the misery of teaching without any of the, any of the fun.
Well,
and so I do think there is. So it's easy for me to see a world where, for the most part, higher education is the way it's all constituted is going to change. In particular, when I look at community colleges and the much larger 4-year institutions, I just can't see that holding up. The economics, the dynamics of it don't work, and that makes sense to me. And there are very this would drive Morra crazy, but I try to think about why would we, our children who are in preschool right now, why would we send them to college? I'm trying to figure that
Well,
out.
hold on, let me.
I don't have a very good answer. It seems like really expensive.
Well, here's the counterweight, and this is, you know, I think this is really important, is that to me it's all about the network, right? It's all about your social network, and the reason why, you know, we benefit so deeply from being at institutions is largely because of the people that we meet and the networks that we form and the credentialing that we get. You know, Ezra Klein has a lot more credentials being at the Washington Post than if he had just been some nerd blogger, you know, who now started this thing. Credentials matter. Where this will all go to hell is if all of a sudden you can bring a portable network with you. The way that you can bring, I mean, I always joke my office is in my purse because I have my laptop and my phone. If I could bring my social network, which I can at my point in career now, my social network is all online. I don't need to be affiliated with any institution anymore. I'm done. I'm me, I'm a free agent, and my institution travels with me on LinkedIn.
And I think actually, and the technology doubles down on your power as an individual brand, not institutional brands associated with you.
Absolutely. I don't need to go work at a giant firm anymore, right? I don't need it. And that is where institutions are going to really be in trouble, is if the quality of the coursework is okay, but there's no power to that institution, and to the networking.
Thank you for these insights. Really, really, really interesting. I'm an EdTech entrepreneur. British originally, now in San Francisco, assisting us. My question's over something different, and perhaps controversial, but something different. And that's the connection that I see that kind of jars with me somewhat, being a European coming here. This really close connection between sort of capitalism and democracy. Really intertwined the money aspect of politics here. Just to give a bit more context, I read a month ago, there was a fairly controversial study that said America isn't actually a democracy, it's an oligarchy. I thought it was quite interesting. I was like, well, that's a powerful statement. And there's a saying in Europe, I don't know, I think it's an easy jibe, it's like America's got the best politicians money can buy. And you know, you have this, just the sheer cost of the elections, and you talked about the application of technology has been a fundraising one. I'm really interested in this whole piece because there seems to be a growing demographic sort of trend of a failure of capitalism, a distrust of capitalism, Wall Street connection to Washington. And so is the just sheer cost, is that sustainable? Do you think that's going to change? Do you think there will actually be a backlash from social media to a much truer form of democracy? Because that's actually the real power of technology. Yeah. It's not about the fundraising, but the real powering a smaller voice, which you have referred to. But I just think it's kind of, they're almost in conflict with each other.
Well, I do think, you know, this is the great warning, right, of the Founding Fathers, was don't let the economic interests hijack the government. That was what they were most worried about.
Do you think that's happened?
I think that yeah, I think that has. I'm not totally pessimistic.
No.
Actually, our story is we both lived and worked in Washington, D.C., and we had to get out of there because it just was really disturbing. One of my roommates when I lived in D.C. is, two of them actually are producers of House of Cards, right? Like, that was like, not that anybody got killed or anything, but the close relationship, the culture of influence. Elizabeth Drew has an exceptional book that's a decade old called The Corruption of American Politics, where she describes it's not a quid pro quo, it's about influence and relationship, right? That your kids are going to soccer with the other guy's kids and your friends, and it's very hard to navigate out of it. It's a systemic. John McCain has spoken eloquently about this, that it's not about individual corruption, it's about a system that prioritizes certain kinds of decisions and certain kinds of decision makers in ways that don't reflect the public interest, right? And I think it is harder than ever for many groups and activists who represent the public interest to actually get heard, not just inside of Washington, D.C., but inside of state capitals too.
Well, and this directly ties into the tribe aspect of the internet, because there's no absolute truth anymore. And so, I mean, I think that mixed with the entrepreneurship, absolute authority, and and the other thing is the aspirational nature of the American culture, fueled by entrepreneurship form, fueled by Silicon Valley, where everybody thinks that they can be rich, and pretty easily. It's much harder to sit and honestly have a conversation with yourself about inequality in student loans. If you think that you could make the next $1 million sexting app, then maybe having $80,000 in debt is not that bad. I actually think it's kind of a numbing of the American mind, because we're actually not looking at the issues we need to, because we can always find an answer that makes us happy. And I blame the internet for that. It's truthiness, as Stephen Colbert calls it. And I think that that is a real problem, and I actually think the onus is on us to take a hard look.
I mean, at the end of the day,
yeah.
at the end of the day, I'm not, at the end of the day, I'm relatively, I have great hope and faith in the American people and their general rational take on things, and their sense of what they want out of the country and out of the leaders. And so 35, under 40, there's a real shift in cultural attitudes about achievement, ambition, and acquisition, the rise of the sharing economy, attitudes about money, compensation, about achievement. I think there are really some profound cultural shifts underway that will eventually get reflected in the leadership. It's the baby boomer's fault.
I want to talk about this issue you raised around the talent gap, and kind of the talent draining away from traditional institutions. That's something I've been living. And Nicco, you know, you were good enough a couple months ago to talk to a group of public servants in Canada where I work about some of these issues around your book. And you know, one of the things I've been living, I think exactly as you were bringing up, this kind of all the incentives are out there to do your own thing, right? To do something small, kind of a startup. And this last year, I worked for the Canadian government, I do social media related work, and actually kind of interesting work trying to change the institution. At the same time, I started a startup company on the side to see if we could get that going. And it was fascinating to me that friends and family and everybody else couldn't care less about what I was doing in government, which arguably probably was making a better impact on the world, but were fascinated about this startup, which was really just about kind of bus times and getting people on their bus on time, right? And so I actually made the decision to stay in the public service and actually step away from the startup, which I feel very good about. It's a tougher path, but I'm happy about it. But for a lot of people, the reaction was almost that I was a defeat of some sort, and they were really hoping that I would leave government, you know, and pursue the startup side. And so somebody who cares about the public service and the public sector, I mean, that's a real challenge to me. And a lot of, I think, young public servants, I think we can give a lot back, are having the same pressures for a bunch of reasons. So, what I wonder is, there's two paths that can go. One is, at some point, you know, we're able to keep enough talent in there to change these institutions. But at what point, you know, do we have to say, okay, maybe the old institutions are just broken, and we have to rebuild something from scratch because it's too far of a bridge to cross? I mean, I'm curious your reaction to that. If you think these old institutions are reformable, or if we're going to have to burn down the old buildings and build something new.
It's half and half. It's a little bit of both.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think that one of the reasons I teach here at Kennedy School, one of the reasons I love the Kennedy School, is that it's meant to be, in many ways, like this living memorial to John Kennedy, this notion about to inspire us to public service, right? To think about what we can do for our country and for the world. That's a powerful animating notion, the idea of public service. It actually loops back into the prior comment about political ambition. You know, that I think part of the challenge of American politics is the notion of public service has faded, and that a lot of what happens is about a career pursuit to be a $2 million a year lobbyist after you're a U.S. senator, or whatever the path there is, right? And that at the heart of what I believe we have to do, everyone in this room has to do, part of what this institution, Kennedy School, must do, is to be a real testament to the importance of public service, to the crucial kind of way we think about this in terms of contributing to the public good.
Well, and I think it's really interesting. I mean, you brought up, and there's nothing sexier than saying you're an entrepreneur, right? It's like people just kind of react to you.
There's one thing sexier, so you could say you're Morra's husband.
Oh. But where I think think we're actually going, and you pointed to, and you too, I mean, I think the ed tech sector is a really interesting example, and what I would like to see is a duality. I mean, I'd love to see a world where you could be an entrepreneur and you could be a public servant, you know, and where you could work in ed tech, but you could also work within the school system to help change. I mean, I actually am very hopeful at looking in spaces like ed tech, where I would hope that, you know, we can have a little bit of breakdown and more public-private partnerships. And you know, I know a lot of people like you who are kind of working in the system and moonlighting on the side, and that makes for a very kind of innovative culture, but it's probably hard to sustain.
It's not. I mean, it's not sustainable in the long term. You know, and I'm lucky because my day job, we have a bit of a startup culture of the team that I run inside of government, but that's an anomaly, and we have to fight hard to kind of protect that from the bureaucratic forces that want to normalize it. And that's, you know, and I think you're right. I mean, to me, some of it's kind of how do we create those safe spaces for? I think you can absolutely be a public servant and be an entrepreneur, but you know, you have to kind of create spaces that allow entrepreneurship to happen in the public sector.
Right.
Well, you know, Morra wrote this piece for Harvard Business Review about entrepreneurship because she's had to live with me as an entrepreneur, she's an entrepreneur. It's actually pretty much miserable. And I think we both hate it every day. Right? But it is, at this point, it's my unalterable career. I'm not sure I could have a boss, you know, other than Morra. So I do think, I think that we have really made entrepreneurship seem much more compelling than it actually is. And by the same token, we've kind of lost a lot of the shine and the compelling nature of being a public servant. I was recently in Latin America, and it was so fantastic to talk to these graduate students and undergrads whose highest aspiration was to be a public servant and like do things for the good of the country. And it felt like something lost in American culture to some extent, right? And kind of part and parcel of that is they did see journalism and being a journalist as kind of a core job in the service to the public in a way that was exciting and compelling. And I don't feel like I hear that from in American culture. It's certainly not reflected back to us in the pop culture at all.
Right.
Well, I'm just focusing back on journalism. My name is Kerry Conner. I'm a tech lawyer in San Francisco, but I'm talking about my son, who's a graduate of college 2011, Harvard Crimson, and he is a journalist. And he is one of the few people who's actually trying to crack that business. And he's worked at Fortune, and he currently is on staff at Forbes. And I have to say, it is the young people are reacting rationally to the sets of incentives and the business world that they inhabit. Time Inc. has had a hiring freeze for years. They will take the kids on 11-month contracts so they're not full-time employees, and then they're gone. Okay, he's at Forbes, which, as you may know, has now got this weird hybrid of bloggers, essentially, that is somewhat curated by young people, and then a few staff members. But if you look, they actually will show how many readers every article gets.
It's brutal.
And that is how they are measured by performance. He is the only person on staff at Forbes under 30 years old. And he probably is only there because he went to Harvard College and there's a little Harvard Crimson network, okay, which is another theme of all this discussion. But they are reacting rationally. There is no economic certainty to them. The business has collapsed and they're not responsible for it. So they have to build their own individual brands, and even these famous columnists at the sui generis New York Times, which is not emblematic of the broader journalism world at all, they're doing exactly what they are told to do because they look at those numbers too. And they say, we will get more traffic by building the Christoph brand than the New York Times brand, which is boring. So I just think the young people, to the extent we're sort of blaming them for growing up in a culture where they are responding rationally to the culture that has been presented to them.
I'm not, Nicco blames the boomers, as you can clearly tell. I'm not blaming them at all. I mean, I agree with you, and I'm with you. I mean, a powerful digital brand is the most powerful thing you can have in our culture.
They have no choice at this point. There's not really a genuine dichotomy of let's go turn the institutions inside out. He tried to do that. or he was willing to do that. He was willing to work at Time Inc. Even when he was a summer intern, he went there and they still had an old-fashioned internship program, which is now gone in corporate cost cutting. There isn't any alternative for them, and actually the institutions are telling them, forcing them to build their individual brands. That's how they get measured, by their own performance.
It is kind of, it is a little troubling. I find the whole emphasis, even though I participate in it and I teach it and think it's important, I do find the emphasis on the individual brand in the digital world troubling in a lot of ways. It certainly doesn't incentivize notions of public service, right? And it's probably part of a broader cultural push towards achievement measurement.
At the same time, isn't it easier for somebody who wants to start a cause to attract people to it? Through their own, it may be their individual brand, but it may be in service of something greater. I mean, that's a separate question as to what purposes people wish to use the platform for.
Well, and what impacts the platforms have. I mean, I think a crucial question is, like I've been thinking about this, what's the hashtag, bring
back our girls.
Bring back our girls. The LA County Board of Supervisors did a big Bring Back Our Girls hashtag campaign, and I was wondering about, is it appropriate and important for the LA County Board of Supervisors to spend a whole bunch of time and money on social media around bringing back 200, 300 kidnapped Nigerian girls? What is the dynamics of that? And I even tried to figure out how many people of Nigerian descent or the Nigerian diaspora were citizens of LA County, right? Like, what's driving this? And I think there's kind of crucial questions about the ethics of attention in the digital world. And it goes back to integrity in institutions and ideas of public service.
Well, and the best minds of our generation wanting to just gather as many Twitter followers as they can. I mean, absolutely.
We're digital people, and I believe that digital campaigns can matter and can have impact, but they can also be a distraction from actually having impact. Right?
Well, the last sentence, the data point is that they track these views. So my son's all-time #1 article is a comparative review of 2 game consoles, 350,000 hits in Forbes. His scoop on a Silicon Valley company going public, a scoop, a journalistic scoop that he worked the phones, old-fashioned stuff, 2,000 hits. So even a Forbes is going to start steering stuff towards the 300,000 hit game review.
Look, I think in the culture we've always, pre-technology, the base instincts of the culture always have been a part of the equation. But we used to have stronger institutional and cultural gatekeepers to make sure there was some focus on matters of importance, right? And as those institutions have, in part by their own fault and in part weakened by trends, including technological ones, as they've receded or taken on a weakened role, the whole thing has gotten confused and terrifying and fun.
One more question.
Sorry, I've asked one already, so I'm more over my fair share. But I think what you're talking about, there's a difference between what I see as entrepreneurs and what I see as entrepreneurs, with a W. There's this kind of cult of the entrepreneur being like the rock star, right? And I think there are definitely entrepreneurs out there solving big real world problems, and it's like make the next $1 billion company by figuring out a solution to $1 trillion problems, and all the $1 trillion problems are big social problems, whether it be health or education, etc. But there is definitely a push, this kind of, and to me it's the amount of money that gets spent in media as well. My wife puts it incredibly eloquently, and excuse my language, but it's like people do jobs they don't enjoy, to buy shit they don't need, to impress people they don't like. And so much money gets fueled into that. And actually there are pockets certainly of just amazing innovations happening, but it is a trend because they're getting funded. These entrepreneurs, smart people that are figuring out better ways to sell people more stuff.
Well, and And it's very appealing if I can put something on Pinterest that I've just bought and made a haul video on YouTube, and I can all of a sudden have a sense of power and being known and standing for something. That's really powerful, especially if I'm a young woman. So I mean, if we're all complicit in that cycle, empowered by the digital age of being seen, of being a brand, and being someone. And a lot of it is tied to consumerism, and it is tied to the lesser angels of our nature. I think what we could finish on is just saying that the internet, we've seen it, has tremendous capacity to organize us for good. And we're in a tough time right now. We're figuring it all out. They're both. They're both, as you just said.
Thank you very much for your time.